सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
India has two broad ways in which it measures inflation. Now, you'd think that, even though that there are two ways, they'd broadly coincide, they'd go in the same direction because they're measuring the same thing. They're looking at inflation. But what we're actually finding out is that the CPI, which is the consumer price index, and the WPI, which is the wholesale price index, have often in the past been at divergence where one is rising and the other is falling. And this is what has happened in the latest data as well. The January data for the WPI comes in at 4.73%, which is the lowest since January 2021. In 2 years, it's come the lowest. But at the same time, the CPI has come in at 6.52, which is back above the 6% limit that the RBI had put. So, and it's higher than it's been in the last 3 months. I think last time it was higher was in October 2022. So why is it that if they're looking, in theory, measuring the same things, that is inflation, why is there such a discrepancy? Which one is looking at what? That's what we're going to look at in this episode of Macrosutra. The broad question is, why is it that one measure of inflation is moving down and the other one is moving up? I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor at ThePrint, and we have with us Radhika Pandey, Senior Fellow at NIPFP. Thank you so much, Radhika, as always, for joining us.
Thank you, Sharad.
So now, Radhika, first of all, let's start at the very basic, which is, why do we have two measures of inflation? Do we need to?
Yes, so we need actually, there are various measures of inflation, but broadly if we say, we have the consumer price index, which measures inflation at the retail level,
right,
which is at the what we are paying for various goods and services that we consume, and the wholesale price index measures prices at the wholesale level, that is at the first point of bulk sale. So that is the wholesale price level. So there are two ways of measuring inflation. In fact, we have one more, which is not measured in a way which we don't commonly observe, but it is there, which is the GDP deflator, which is the ratio of GDP at current prices over GDP at constant prices. So it also is a measure of prices, but it is a lagged indicator because we know that GDP is a quarterly measure. Right. So this will also be a quarterly measure, and it comes with a lag of 2 months after the end of the quarter. So while we do have broadly 3 measures, but in terms of looking at inflation trends, we focus on consumer price index and the wholesale price index.
Because they come out monthly.
They come at monthly frequency. They are now very timely. Both of them are released by before 15th of the next month. We have the data, like we now have the data for January for both wholesale price index as well as CPI.
Yes. So now broadly you've mentioned that they look at different things. Just looking at the point on the supply chain that WPI comes in and that CPI comes in, could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, so basically it boils down to how we are measuring wholesale price index and how we are measuring consumer price index. What is the composition? What are the weights in the index? So first, let's start with consumer price index. Consumer price index, as we said, it is measuring at the retail level what consumers are paying. So how do we determine what is going inside the CPI?
But literally, it's the price when we go to the shop when we're buying something. It is
CPI. But what is the basket of goods that we are capturing in CPI, and what is the basket of goods that we are capturing in wholesale price index?
Right.
That basket is different, and within that basket also the weights of the various commodities are different. This is because in CPI we are measuring at the consumer level, so there the weights come from the consumer expenditure survey, which is conducted by the National Statistical Office. Once every 5 years, the consumer expenditure expenditure surveys conducted where consumers are asked, what is your consumption expenditure? What is your average consumption expenditure? And out of that, how much you are spending on, say, cereals, how much you are spending on fruits, vegetables, on services, and so on.
Milk, all of that.
Milk, everything. So, and based on that, the weights of commodities are determined in the CPI basket.
Okay.
Now, that is very important because, as we've talked about earlier also, there are interstate variation. There are differences in consumption patterns. So, a rural household consumption pattern will be different from an urban household consumption pattern.
Yes.
So that is why the weights in the rural CPI are different from the weights in the urban CPI. Weights in the rural CPI for food is more than the weights in the urban CPI because rural households are spending more proportion of their consumption expenditure on food and less on, say, other non-food items. So that is why these weights are coming from consumer expenditure survey. Whereas in WPI, the weights or the basket of WPI comes from the production value. You know, what is the production value of commodities? Net the imported value. So that is the way the weight is determined in WPI. It's basically the production value. So it's at the production level, whereas this is the CPI is at the consumption level. That's the basic difference in the supply chain.
I mean, so would it be fair to say that one is the price at the mandi and the other is price at your the market that you go and buy things?
Yes. That is a basic way of telling the distinction, especially for food item. That is the way we can talk about the differences. Now, the other thing is that there are a lot of things which are not captured in WPI, but they are captured in CPI.
Right.
For example, services. How much we are spending on our health expenditures are captured in CPI but not in WPI. So
same with education?
All services. So WPI only includes goods, and mostly what it includes is inputs and manufactured goods. And therefore, as we talked about within WPI, almost 64% of the weight is of manufactured products. And within manufactured products, we say like chemicals, textiles, commodities that we talk about, they are all captured in WPI. Now, because now there is trade liberalization, now the prices are not administered. Therefore, basically what WPI is capturing is our tradable commodities.
Right. And
therefore, whenever global headwinds, if we want to study the impact of global headwinds, we first study on WPI because the WPI basket is mostly of tradables, whereas CPI is non-tradables because it covers mostly food and services. That is something which, as a typical Indian household, we are consuming. So that brings about the difference in that's a main reason for the divergence between WPI and CPI.
And it's also then an important reason why we have two measures.
Yes. We have to have two measures because once we want to study what is how the global headwinds are capturing the prices. So there, the first hit will be on WPI, and then from WPI, it may happen to CPI depending on the government's response. For example, if during the Russia-Ukraine war, we saw that the edible oil prices were rising, sunflower oil prices were rising, palm oil prices were rising because Russia and Ukraine are one of the chief suppliers of sunflower oil. So what did the government do? Government reduced the import duties on sunflower oil. So there we saw the impact of internal policies. So that will have an impact on CPI because what we are consuming will be lower, the price will be lower because now the duties have been reduced. So that is how there's a distinction between WPI, which captures the impact of global factors. Crude oil prices, whenever crude oil prices are going up or down, first impact will be on WPI. It may or may not happen on CPI depending on how the government responds to the changes in prices.
With taxation measures.
With taxation,
so,
yes.
So, but it doesn't also always follow that the direction of WPI with a lagged effect that CPI will follow it as well, because
Yes.
that depends on how the government responds.
Yes, it depends. It may or may not happen that way, because if we look at the last 10 years trajectory, we have seen that there have been three broad periods where WPI and CPI have diverged widely.
Right.
One of the recent episode is the COVID time, where we saw that WPI was in deflation.
In
Deflation.
negative. Right.
Yes, in negative. WPI contracted, whereas CPI was 5%, 6%.
Yeah.
So now CPI is high because of high food prices and because of domestic supply bottlenecks, whereas WPI contracted because there was lack of production, global crude oil prices plummeted in the international markets, and therefore WPI contracted. So that is one episode where WPI was lower than CPI. And then came the Russia-Ukraine war,
Right.
where WPI surged much higher than CPI.
Because of crude oil prices.
Because again of crude oil
Yeah.
prices. So we have done an analysis, and that we've talked about in the article also, that there is a correlation of almost 0.8 between WPI and global crude oil prices.
Oh, wow.
So whenever global crude oil prices move up and down, WPI follows the trajectory very closely, and therefore we can actually see what's happening to WPI based on global crude oil prices.
Right. So just a brief explanation. So correlation basically is a tool to measure how two different data sets move, whether they move together or they don't. So if there's a correlation, as she says, of 0.8, that means that there's a very strong positive correlation. As one moves up, the other will move up. As one moves down, the other will also move down. You also have negative correlation. So for example, if this was minus 0.8, then that would mean that while one moved up, the other moved down. And when the first moved down, the other would move up. So that is what correlation basically means. Now, coming to the weightages,
Yes.
This is an important factor why CPI and WPI are different. But is it possible that even looking at something like food inflation, that it's possible that in WPI food inflation is rising, but in CPI it's falling, or the other way around, that in WPI it's falling, but in CPI it's rising?
Yes, that is possible, because one factor we discuss is the impact of government policy, that while the international prices are rising and WPI is mirroring the rise in international prices, CPI may not follow because of government intervention. Government interventions in the form of, say, supply side measures, import duty reduction, or placing some quotas. For example, for sugar exports, we imposed quotas on sugar export.
Right.
Wheat exports. So those are all the factors through which government tries to control the prices that households have to pay. So that is one reason. The other reason is that it may be that WPI is falling but CPI may be rising because there is this role of intermediaries, or there is this role of logistics.
Right.
So maybe that the intermediaries are capturing a lot of profit, or appropriating a big chunk of profits, and that is why they are charging higher prices to consumers. So there are these different factors through which WPI and CPI may diverge. Even the same commodity, say WPI cereals and CPI cereals, may diverge, mainly due to the impact of government policies, and secondly due to the role of intermediaries, which the government is now trying to address through various means. But if we go back, say 10 years back, then these factors did play an important role, and we used to talk about something called markup cost. So if the intermediaries are charging a big markup, so wholesale prices may be low, but what is coming to consumers may be very high. So that creates the big difference between WPI and CPI.
And we mentioned that CPI looks at it's on the basis of the consumption patterns.
Correct. Yes.
And this survey happened about a decade ago, and we're waiting for the next one to happen. But similarly, is there some sort of basis for the weightage of WPI? On what basis do they
Yes, so WPI weightage is based on, as we discussed, the net traded value.
Okay.
That is the weight is for WPI also the weight, the base year is 2011-12. So now for both WPI and CPI, the base year is 2011-12. And there was this talk of changing the base year, but WPI, the weight is determined on the basis of the net traded value.
Right.
That is, what is the extent or what is the magnitude of production of that particular commodity,
I see.
net of imports, net of the value of imports.
Oh, so
that
purely domestic production.
Yes, purely domestic production as well as exports.
And exports,
Net, we just exclude the imported value. So higher will be the weightage in the wholesale price index.
So what, like for example, what are the things that we produce lots of that would then have a very high weightage in WPI?
So that is why the manufactured products have a high weight within
Right.
WPI. The thing that we are trading, the thing that we are exporting, we are producing as well as exporting, they will have a higher weightage. That is why the entire set of manufactured products has a higher weight in the,
Right.
we have like 64%. Now manufactured product is also a broad category. Within manufactured products, we have food products also.
That are manufactured.
That are manufactured.
Right.
For example, bakery products, anything which is not coming straight from the farm, but
all
which
of your
is
packaged food.
all
right?
of the packaged food, yes, that will be covered under the food product, which has a weight of 9% in WPI. And overall, within WPI, there are two baskets of food. We have food articles and food products.
Right.
And together they constitute around 25% of the WPI basket, whereas in CPI, because consumers spend a lot on food, so overall the weight is 46%, where in rural it is different and urban it is different. So on average we come to 46% weight. So that is how the weight is determined, and WPI has three broad categories. We have the fuel and light, we have manufactured products, and we have primary articles. So these are the three, whereas in CPI there are six broad components, where we are talking about food and beverages, fuel and light, we are talking about clothing, footwear, housing, and miscellaneous. So those are the six components depending on the consumption pattern.
And now we've mentioned this before in a previous episode, but basically the WPI is measured by the Ministry of Commerce.
Yes.
And the CPI is measured by the Ministry of Statistics. Does this bring about any change, any variation in the two? Is the way that they measure these things different?
The way they measure is different, because as we said, what we are measuring, the unit is different, the markets are different. In CPI, we are talking about urban and rural markets, when we are talking. So one is the weight, and the other is the price. So basically it is an index, which is a product of your fixed weights. Weights are coming from 2011-12 consumption shares. That is how much you spend out of your overall consumption expenditure in 2011-12. How much did you spend on, say, rice, wheat, and other your consumption basket? So that is the weight, but the prices are coming from the notified markets. Now there are around 1170 markets in rural areas and 1100 odd markets in urban areas, through which price quotations are taken of those commodities, and then they are multiplied to arrive at the index.
And these are standard markets for both the WPI and CPI?
No, those are for CPI.
Only CPI?
Yes, whereas WPI, it is the value of production. Whereas here we are going to the shops and we are measuring the price at which they are selling to the household. So that is where the difference arises.
So then obviously the method of data collection also
is absolutely different.
With CPI, you'll actually have to go to the shops and everything, but WPI, you have the data coming in.
Yes, that is the difference, because here the agents have to go to the shop, they have to take quotation of the various difference. For example, rice also, there are 3-4 varieties. There's PDS rice is different, wheat PDS is different, non-PDS rice and wheat are different. So one has to take quotations and then come up with these prices. And you saw, yesterday there was some confusion regarding the CPI cereal index, where the CPI cereal index calculated and one which was reported was different. So
Correct.
these things arise because you are taking what constituents are going into serial index that may create some calculation errors, and that is why there was some problem yesterday regarding the CPI serials.
Right. And now, given that the WPI is dealing with tradables,
Yes.
It makes sense to keep it under the Ministry of Commerce, or
Yes. It makes sense to keep them under Ministry of Commerce because we are dealing with tradables. The entire basket is tradables, and it moves. As we talked about correlation. If we look at correlation with some of the domestic price, international price measures like U.S. Producer Price Index, there is again a very high co-movement or high correlation between our Indian CPI and US Producer Price Index. So it's actually the production less imported value, and the basket is all tradables. We are producing something which also has an international price, so it's highly dependent on tradable. So it's good to keep in that ministry.
Right. And now we have a question from one of our audience, which is it talks about a topic that we've talked about in a previous episode, but it's worth going into this time as well, which is that different parts of India have different consumer behavior, and therefore their preferences change in respect of goods. Like, for example, there's more rice consumption in eastern and southern parts of India as compared to North India. How do we assign weights to each commodity to calculate a national average, considering the fact that we have such a diverse consumer behavior?
Yes, so that's a very important question. And normally, as we've discussed earlier, we just look at the India CPI level.
National.
We don't know that it's just an average, and it masks the variations within the states.
Right.
And these variations can arise either because of difference in weights, which is the fixed weights coming from the 2011-12 base year, or due to difference in prices. And prices may be different because in the different 1180 markets, the prices may be different.
Of course.
Point about consumption pattern is captured in the different weights, because if you look at the CPI manual, which is released by the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, you will find that the weights are different. It's not an all India level weight. We are talking about a household, and that household may be living in some village of Bihar, or maybe living in some urban area in Maharashtra.
Right.
So depending on that, the consumption pattern varies, and therefore the weights are also different. And these different weights are captured within the rural and urban areas of different states. For example, Bihar has a higher share of, in the Bihar CPI, higher share is of rural areas, almost 85%. And urban is only 14%, 84 and 14 on average, that's the difference. So that means most of the consumption is coming from the rural areas in Bihar. Whereas if we look at a state like Gujarat and Maharashtra, it is the other way around, where the weight of urban is more than rural areas. So these variations in consumption pattern, variations between rural and urban areas, variations in where rice is consumed more or wheat is consumed more, variations within whether food is being consumed more or services are being consumed more.
Right.
All these are captured within the consumer expenditure survey, and it's a very useful exercise to look at their questionnaire. What questions they are asking to the Indian household. That gives a very nice way of understanding the consumption pattern, and that questionnaire is publicly available. One can have a look at that.
Right. And it stands to reason that this consumer expenditure survey needs to be done regularly, because we're still now referring to data that is from 2011-12.
Right.
So we do need to update it, and the government is saying that it is going to do it. It'll release the results soon, in a few years or so. So now another question that we have from the audience. Now this is more conceptual. Basically, we know that to combat inflation, the RBI increases its interest rates. But what the question we have here is asking, basically, does the increase of retail inflation, is it because of continuous rate hikes by the RBI? Basically, he's asking, is it happening that the other way around is happening, that the RBI is raising rates, raising interest rates, and so loans are becoming more expensive, and so this is driving inflation. Is that a possibility?
No, it's actually because prices are rising, and therefore, from the viewpoint of a monetary policy, the only tool available in the hands of monetary policy or central bankers' monetary policy committee is the interest rate. So they are trying to address inflation and address rise in inflation expectation,
Right.
anchor inflation expectations through increase in interest rate, and giving some kind of communication that this may not be the end of the rate hike cycle, which they said last week,
Yeah.
that the core inflation is still persistent, cereal prices are rising. So while vegetables are giving the comfort, vegetable prices, but that's not the end of the rate hike cycle. So basically they're using interest rate as a tool to address the rise in inflation. There are other tools in the hands of the fiscal policy, but for monetary policy, it is the rate of interest and the communication, which is what they are doing. So it will help in reducing inflation. So rise in interest rate is a tool to reduce inflation. So
Right.
it is unlikely that increase in interest rate is leading to higher inflation.
Higher inflation, right. So there you go. We have two measures of inflation. Both are necessary for different elements of policy making. The WPI, which is the wholesale price index, is looking at how global factors can possibly be affecting prices in India. The CPI reflects more domestic policy changes, how the retail price, the price that you and I go pay in the market, how that can be impacted by the policies of the government of the day. Both are actually very important measures, and the reason that they are moving sometimes in tandem, sometimes not in tandem, is because of the different weightages, what they're measuring, the weightage that they give to different elements, where the WPI is looking more at tradable goods. The CPI includes things like services and has a higher weightage for food. So that's what results in what's happened the latest data in January, where WPI and CPI data has actually diverged, where one is moving up, the other is moving down. That's all we have for you this time around. Thank you so much for watching.